Hi, everyone. Welcome back. We're still waiting for our final speaker. I don't know if he's got lost somewhere in cyberspace, but I'm assuming we'll catch him in due time. In the meantime, I want to start off with our next panel, our next session, which I'm really honored to introduce. Uh, we call this session the politics of gun violence, but really, properly speaking, it should be called the politics of addressing gun violence. And we're, as I say, honored to have with us the presidents of two of the city councils of two of America's most important and major cities. We have Felicia Moore, president of the Atlanta City Council. We have Lorena Gonzalez, who's the president of the Seattle City Council. Felicia Moore, by the way, is in the running for mayor. I thought I'd just give you a quick plug on that. Your voters are probably not here today, but so you can say whatever you want, um, although we are recorded. But and we have Marlon Peterson, the renowned podcaster, author, and lecturer. Our fourth speaker is Anthony Smith from Cities United, and I hope he'll be with us shortly. The point of this panel really is that we've really been working up to it for the last day and a half. Is really the missing link in discussions about ways to address gun violence is what the political response is going to be. I mean, we've already seen some early political responses in the sense that the headlines that talk about a surge in crime, a surge in violent crime in particular, has already provoked a message, not unexpectedly, from people who say, well, it's our fault that it's happening because we've just gone soft on crime again. We've begun to do some justice reforms which have allowed more predators to roam the streets. This is, of course, we've heard this before. It's a powerful message, and there are people who are worried about it and how it might affect justice reform in all aspects of the justice system, but certainly in the particular area we're talking about now, which is gun violence and violent crime. So I thought what I would do is start off with first, the Atlanta City Council President Felicia Moore moved to Ms. Gonzalez, and then have Anthony Smith, if he's with us. There he is. Welcome, Anthony, to talk a little bit more about the attitude of the mayors around the country towards this, and then sort of follow up with commentary from the ever articulate and wise Marlon Peterson. So let me start with Felicia Moore. Felicia, I'll give you. You have about 10 minutes or so to do some opening remarks, but welcome to Center for Media, Crime, and Justice webinar on gun violence and public health. You need to unmute your...
Make sure that I'm being heard. Thank you so much. And I'd like to thank John Jay College for inviting me to participate in this blue ribbon panel today. I really wish we all could be together in the same space, because this is a wonderful group of speakers you've gathered. And it would have been great to mingle with you all and get to know you a bit. I'm especially appreciative that we're gathering on this important topic of gun violence. Unfortunately, the city of Atlanta has experienced a lot of gun violence, and I'm sure that is shared with everyone who is here in this room. As Steve mentioned, I am Felicia Moore, and I'm currently serve as the president of Atlanta City Council, and I'm a candidate for mayor of Atlanta. Before my service as city council president, I was elected 5 terms as a city representative for one of the most diverse districts from income, race, national origin. My district, it spanned from the affluent Buckhead neighborhood through the middle class West Side neighborhoods and down to the working class and even impoverished sections of Northwest Atlanta. The most important thing I learned by representing such a diverse district is that we have far more in common than people think. No matter what your zip code or household income, people want to feel safe in their persons and their homes. They want to feel safe walking their dog, going to the store, strolling their babies, or taking a jog. And as you mentioned earlier, violent crime is up. It's up 58% in Atlanta. And there's not a resident or business in our city that hasn't felt the devastating sting of loss from violence. So when it comes to the politics of gun violence, for a public servant like me, there are a matrix of issues involved. You know, public safety, crime prevention, security infrastructure, community engagement, policing, and police reform, and the list goes on and on. These issues are both deeply personal and in the last several years have become deeply political. Each neighborhood wants to know that their concerns and needs are being equitably addressed. It's urgent to each person in each neighborhood. So as an elected official, as a legislator, we receive a regular flood of petitions from public interest groups that span the gamut from Second Amendment protectionists to Moms Demand Action and the youth organizers of March for Our Lives. There is a reality that there is the reality of what a municipality can do as a matter of policy based on our limitations of our city charter and what we have to defer to the state of Georgia. And what I mean by that, for example, in 2010, when Atlanta experienced another spike in gun violence, the city council unanimously approved a resolution that would request the Georgia State Legislature to allow Atlanta to curb gun sales. The resolution would allow Atlanta to have the authority to restrict what guns could be sold within the city limits. Now, given that hardline conservatives were in the majority, and they still are, we didn't have much hope that the legislation would be approved, and it wasn't. But we felt it was imperative that we demonstrated to our constituents that we are doing everything in our power as their public servants to curb gun violence. And this is an example of politics at play on a major issue of concern. You know, when people are frightened, these distinctions are difficult to explain and educate around, some things which are a little bit more nuanced and which go beyond civics 101. So that's why I've always had this open door policy and open phone policy when it comes to constituent relations. The central values on which I serve have always been, and what I'm known for, ethics, transparency, and accountability. And I believe it's irresponsible for elected officials to allow legislation to move forward without a significant amount of community discussion. So I want to give you a couple of other brief points before I let my learned colleagues share their experience. After the Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School shooting, I was so impressed by the youth who rose up and took commanding leadership on the issue of gun violence. I'm so proud of the youth in Atlanta who also organized. They didn't just stop at March for Our Lives. They routinely petitioned our Atlanta City Council and our state legislature. We even have one of the marchers who's running now for the Atlanta School Board. He's 22 years old now. I've met him. We did a forum together recently, and his name is Royce Mann. He exemplifies how political activists on any issue at any age can affect real change and are unafraid to take on major leadership roles. Finally, I'd like to say that I believe the effectiveness of city-level politics on gun violence or any other issue of national importance can be significantly increased when cities work together. That has to happen at a mayoral level. We need more collaborative leadership regionally within our metropolitan area like Atlanta, within major geographic areas like the Southeast, where too many of the guns are exported to the Northeast, and even nationally through organizations like the Urban League and the National League of Cities. City councils and legislative bodies can set budgets and approve policy, but it is at the mayor's office that it is chartered to execute, implement operations, and lead. And so those are some of my just brief comments on sort of the politics of gun violence. So
Well,
thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Marlon. Can I make a quick follow-up with a question that,
Sure.
then move right on to Council President Gonzalez too. We've been on an upward trajectory in terms of justice reform, certainly over the last 5 years. And as I was saying in my opening remarks, I wonder whether you feel in Atlanta, and then turning to you, Ms. Gonzalez in Seattle, that the window for reform, genuine reform, has begun to close because of the fears and the perceptions of violence and rising crime. And if that's the case, how do you address it? And if you could just respond to that, then I'll move right on to Council President Gonzalez.
Yes, I would say in Atlanta that that window of reform has not closed. We've had several study groups and we have several measures that some that we have implemented and others we're continuing to look at and to implement. And I believe that the voices of reform have been heard in Atlanta such that, you know, there's no kind of going back on that. We want to keep moving forward. And so I haven't seen where the level of crime in the city as it has risen, that we have decreased our desire to reform policing in the city.
Ms. Gonzalez, does that apply to you in Seattle as well?
I think to a certain extent, yes. I mean, I think that you know, to be fair with the racial reckoning and racial awakening for some after the murder of George Floyd, the window of what was possible in terms of how we could and what we could reform in our overall criminal justice system certainly shifted in a way that allowed policymakers like us to have greater latitude and be, I think, more ambitious in how we wanted to radically transform how we deliver public safety to our residents. I think that with the increase in violent crime in our communities, I feel like the window is not as wide as it was in this time last year, but I still think that window is open, and I still think that there is momentum from you know, movement building folks in our community to still allow us the opportunity to walk, you know, to step through and to reach through that window to really make sure that this isn't a fleeting moment, that we miss the opportunity to do the really hard but necessary transformational work that our communities have been begging us to do for generations.
So, I mean, more specifically, the concept we've been working on for this webinar series is gun violence as a public health issue. Is there support for that in Seattle? And if there is, how are you addressing that as a public health issue?
Yeah, in Seattle, you know, first of all, thanks so much for having me here. Really appreciate the invitation and an opportunity to be in such great company with so many great thought leaders across the country. So I'm Lorena Gonzalez. I currently serve as the president of the Seattle City Council. That's a position that's elected amongst our colleagues. So I was elected to that role in 2020. But I was first elected to the Seattle City Council in 2015 as the first Latinx person elected citywide to a City of Seattle position. And part of my work has been to serve first as the chair of our Public Safety Committee for 4 years. And then now I have transitioned over to being the president of the council, but still serve as the vice chair in our public safety committee, which deals with a host of issues, including gun violence. And during the time that I served as public safety chair, we of course experienced a large number of gun violence incidents throughout our city. It is true that, like most major urban metropolitan cities, we have seen a uptick in the number of violent incidents in our communities and in the use of guns in the execution of that violence. But in Seattle, which is you know, one of the most progressive cities in the nation, you know, we are very, very, very strongly committed to addressing gun violence through a public health lens, and that it has been true consistently throughout the years. And so I just want to talk a little bit about how that commitment has shown up. And it has been driven largely by members of our community, whether it's Mom Demand Action, whether it's March for Our Lives, or whether it's just community-based groups who are tired of being ignored and having their needs not invested in and their needs not resourced in order to allow for resiliency, growth, and healing. So there's a few things that I was really proud to work on together with public health advocates. One was requiring a gun safe storage law. We know that that is a key way to promote responsible gun ownership, but also to keep guns out of the hands of people who might use them to either harm themselves or harm others. When I talked about this piece of legislation and when we built a coalition to pass this gun safe storage law, and Seattle is the only city in Washington state that has this law, we made a public health case to the public as to why this was necessary. So in order to do that, we talked about mental health and the lack of access to mental health. We talked about suicide rates and the number of preventable deaths that are caused by easy access to firearms in the case of suicide. We talked about domestic violence and how domestic violence is one of the major ways in which we see women in our community die because guns are too easily accessible. And through that framing, we were able to successfully get a unanimous support of the city council to implement this law. And we were able to work with the mayor to have the mayor sign the legislation into law. We were then quickly sued by the NRA for passage of this law. But we also had a city attorney who is also independently elected, who was very supportive of this law from the beginning and did an amazing job defending the case. And we were ultimately able to defend that law in a court of law. And it is now the law of the land here in the city of Seattle. We also worked on increasing penalties for those who fail to report lost or stolen firearms. Again, in many of our communities, we hear about the easy access to illegal firearms that are not legally purchased, but are still accessible to our youth and others who are then used in really unfortunate violent situations. And so those are some of the policy things that I think we have really highlighted through a public health response. And I really also and I know we'll have an opportunity to talk more about some of those nitty-gritty policy works, but I think it's really important to, when we're talking about this issue, to really sort of step back a little bit and think about sort of how we define the issue of gun violence and who is and isn't included in that definition. And I lift up one particular example. So when we talk about how an officer shoots one of our members of community, we often refer to it very septically. We talk about how there's an officer involved shooting. What does that mean? What does that mean? Is that a true commitment as a city to a public health approach to the politics of gun violence if we aren't being straight with our community members that what actually happened last night was that a city employee who is a police officer shot and killed a member of our community? And I think that language is really important to humanize what is happening in the area of police violence, but also in the broader area of gun violence. These aren't just folks who are out there causing trouble because they want to cause trouble. This is a symptom of a greater issue. It's a symptom of racial inequity. It's a system of a lack of investment. And it's a system of ignoring the needs of those communities who are most harmed by violent crime by our local elected officials. And this is our opportunity to really lift up what those needs are, for whom we are prioritizing these resources, and how we can truly move away from punitive systems that are designed to punish and hold accountable only, without the other important part of the equation, which is how do we invest in our communities to build resiliency in our economy, in education, in healthcare, and housing stability, to make sure that we are allowing for those trauma-informed approaches to take root in our community and to allow us to all feel safe ultimately in our neighborhoods. And the last thing I'll say in closing is, we don't talk a lot about the built environment in the context of police violence. There's some sort of biting around the edges around this, but this is an area where cities can do a lot. There are interventions that are as simple as better lighting in neighborhoods that see increased crime that makes such a huge difference, not just in crime prevention and in making the place feel safer, but in actually helping people who live in those neighborhoods who have been neglected for generations feel like finally they are getting some level of investment and that they are valued and a welcome part of our cities. And I think that those are really important things that cities can do that aren't directly related to law enforcement, but that are critical to building complete, resilient, safe neighborhoods.
Thank you. We actually heard a little bit of that from the mayor of Baltimore yesterday about some of the measures he's doing in his comprehensive crime prevention program about changing the built environment, making sure people get services that they weren't getting before. But since you brought up the issue, I'd like to go back to maybe both council presidents about how the role of police and police reform is trending right now in both of your cities. Is there an appetite still in Seattle, for instance, and in Atlanta for changing, for reforming police, for moving some of the functions that police perform to civilian services or to other parts of the city? That was an issue. We're not just talking about defunding, we're talking about generally reimagining what police can do and should do. And that's all now in flux now because of the these crime figures. So I'm wondering where you both stand on that. Perhaps I can go through Ms. Moore first, then Ms. Gonzalez, and I'll move to Anthony.
Well, as I said earlier, we haven't stopped the conversation about police reform. Some things we had already done before a lot of that started to come to head. Then others, there were a lot of study groups and there are a lot of lists. So now it's time to execute on some of those lists. And a lot of people, I believe, have an appetite for, and it's certainly part of my platform as mayor, to have those people who can respond to behavioral and mental health issues so we can take that responsibility off of the police. And frankly, the police, I think, will welcome that, that they don't have to try to also be crisis interveners and mental health professionals along with doing their job. So that is certainly something that I will be moving as mayor of the city, but certainly on the list of things that people would like to see happen. Also, I believe that we need to look at just the culture of policing in and of itself. It has a baked in set culture. And as you know, changing culture, it takes a lot of consistent work and effort and change. And certainly I believe we need to really look at the culture of policing and how police interact with our citizens. We want our police officers to keep our citizens safe, but we also want our residents to feel safe if they're interacting with our police officers. We talk about de-escalation training. I don't know that there probably isn't a police a department in the country that doesn't have de-escalation training. But I want to go a step further. Why do we even have to get to that training of de-escalation if we can learn better ways to interact with people so it doesn't escalate? So we need to look at all of those things and getting back to that community policing model where people know their officers and having opportunities where people can interact with officers in other ways besides the only way they see them is that they're arresting them or someone in their family or in some sort of a crisis or conflict situation. So we haven't stopped here in Atlanta looking at that. Now it's a matter of a lot of those things on the list that people have proffered that we should do is getting them done.
Thank you. Council President Gonzalez?
Yeah, I think reform is something that Seattle is very good at. We've been under consent decree with the federal court for 12 years now, working on reforming our police department continuously. And whether you're under a consent decree or not, the work around reform is important, and it is iterative and needs to constantly be changing with what our community expects of it. So it's not mission accomplished kind of scenario. It's we're working on it all the time. And I know this personally, not just as the council president and as somebody who served as a public safety chair, but I was a civil rights attorney for 10 years before becoming an elected official, where I sued police departments, large and small, across the state of Washington for violating people's civil rights, for police brutality, for bias policing. And so we know that the systems that are put in place that are designed to, or were originally designed to protect law enforcement from those kinds of citizen-based complaints are now becoming a very large barrier to truly achieving transformation within our policing systems. And I'm talking about police guild contracts that have taken away management power to fire bad cops and to demilitarize the police department in a way that will fulfill the commitment to community policing. I'm talking about laws in the state of Washington that prohibit us from requiring or giving any kind of preference to applicants who want to be officers who live in the city. The reality is that in the city of Seattle, over 75% of our officers don't live in the city of Seattle. So how are we to achieve true community policing if these individuals clock in, clock out, and go home, and their home is not here? So we need that connectivity. We need ongoing reform, but we also need to acknowledge that politics has created a system that protects officers over and over and over and over again, even in the face of an unlawful killing. And we see that show up in arbitration proceedings. We see it show up in who we can hire. Even in the instance in which an officer has been found guilty of lying, of perjuring him or herself on the stand, and can no longer perform that function of his or her job, we still, if we lay off officers, we still have to give that officer, that officer who was dishonest, a chance at being hired before somebody on the outside. That's how deep the lobbying for police guilds and law enforcement unions has gone. And this is at the state level, and cities have to deal with it. And so this is really, really a significant challenge to creating true and meaningful reform. The reform we are all doing right now is around the edges. It's around what we can do. And it's important we continue to do it. But the reality is that we're going to be moving in little micro movements until we can truly get at the systemic, statewide, federal issues that have been baked into our laws and into our systems that really do stack the deck against people who are seeking justice for their loved ones who've been lost to police violence, or to those who've been subjected to egregious acts of racial bias like stop and frisk and others.
Thank you. Complicated agenda, but let's go back to the first subject at hand, which is the violence in the streets, in neighborhoods themselves. Some of it in reaction or response to police, others when the police come in. And I wonder, Anthony, if you can weigh in on, as someone who can look at the landscape across the country of what mayors and the municipal governments and county governments are doing, to give us your sense of where the issue is trending right now. I mean, I asked earlier about the impact on our reform, but I'm wondering also whether there's a real sense that of fear and perception that we've got to move. We're facing a new sort of crime wave around the country, which statistically it seems to be happening, but if you get below the statistics, that's not really true. But Anthony, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Stephen, and really good to be with you all today. Thank you, John Jay. I'm really excited to hear from both of the presidents of the councils in Atlanta and Seattle. Have the pleasure of working in both of those cities as we all work together to think about how we keep our community safe, healthy, and hopeful, right? So I just want to start there because the way we talk about the work also talks about what kind of solutions and ideas that we put in place and what we do. So if we talk about violence prevention and crime prevention, we're going to go to our normal things. But if we're talking about making sure all of our kids are safe, healthy, and hopeful, we start thinking about different solutions. And I also want to, start this conversation too, I appreciate both of the presidents highlighting March for Our Lives, Guilford, Everytown, and Mom Demand, but I also want to make sure that folks understand that there's a network of national Black and Brown gun violence prevention folks who are working every day to help this issue as well. Cities United being one, our friends at Live Free, the folks at Community Justice Action Fund, National Institute of Criminal Justice Reform, the Hobby, and I mean, that's just a long list of folks who are working across this country, really trying to make sure that we can create these safe, healthy, and hopeful communities. And also just thinking about the politics of gun violence is that, and I appreciate Council President Gonzalez really hitting it at home, it's just about race. We have been losing Black and brown kids for decades to gun violence. And this country has refused at all levels to really move in a different way to really address the issue. There have been community members, community-led organizations who have been saying we have another way, which is how we got to the hospital-based intervention, which is how we got to the violence interrupter models, which is how we got to advanced peace, which is how we got to even GVI, which is a group violence intervention that's led by law enforcement, but it came out of community. And we as a country have never fully invested in those models and in those folks who run those models, because in my estimate is that we as a country have not cared about who's dying in the streets. When Cities United was formed in 2011, Mayor Nutter had a conversation with Dr. Bell, who runs the Casey Family Programs, and said he had no place to go nationally to get information around what he could do to stop the young people from dying in the streets. So they came together and said, let's create Cities United. That created a network of mayors and other community leaders to come together to share best practices, to talk about, as you mentioned, Stephen, Mayor Scott and his comprehensive public safety strategy is what we believe every city needs. Every city needs to have a comprehensive public safety strategy that they're using every day to address the issue of community violence. And it needs to be a collective document that's created by not just government agencies, but community members, but most importantly, those most impacted by community violence need to be at the table. The young people and their families need to be a part of the solutions and need to be helping move the work. So when you think about how we move this, it's really not about reform for me. It really is about how do we reimagine and redefine what public safety is? Because public safety is not just about law enforcement, jails and detention centers. That's the after effect. Public safety really is about affordable housing, safe and affordable housing, access to quality jobs, all of our kids getting a quality education, being able to maneuver around your city. So those are the things that we need to be talking about when we talk about public safety. And we need to move away from that law enforcement and jails and detention centers are the core of our public safety structure. I think that's a big piece for us, is how we talk about it and how we reform it, or not even reform, redefine it is what we need to really be moving from. And I also want to just say, I'm really thankful for this new administration who has come in and really said, this is where we want to be. We want to invest in community violence intervention and prevention strategies. And we're setting aside money for that. We're saying to all of our cities at the city level, county level, and the state level that you can use these American Rescue dollars to support community violence intervention strategies, right? Cities United has been asking all of our cities to set aside 5 to 10% of those dollars to invest in community violence interruption strategies and create an infrastructure that we know would be able to go way beyond the next 3 years if we invest right. So really thankful for that. And also thankful, and I think both cities are part of this community violence intervention collaborative that the president just wrote out as well, which I think is going to be a key piece to this work too. So it starts at the federal level and all of that stuff trickles down to the state, to the county and the city. So to President Moore's point, it's like we need all levels of government to be working in the same direction. And it really is about what do we all need to do, not just to keep our kids from dying, but what do we need to do to make sure that they can live their best lives, right? So it's one thing to stop the killing, but it's another thing to say, okay, all of these young folks now have better opportunities to go to school, to go to work, to live free of crime. And then the last thing I will say is that police violence is gun violence. Dante told us that when he was running the Million Hoodies, is that you can't separate the two. They go hand in hand. And we've got to be working together to make sure that both of those are addressed at the same time, just because there's just a lot of work that we need to do.
Thanks, Anthony. We've been hearing an awful lot about the federal program over the last day and a half, and I do want to get back to that and get all the speakers to talk about how they see the impact of that in their areas. But I'm sure that, in fact, I know that Marlon agrees with your point of view in terms of changing the role of police, but he's looking at it, Marlon, you were looking at it from a different perspective, from the grassroots perspective, from someone who's worked in the field and community intervention and a lot of other ways. So I wonder, hearing what the council presidents have said, what Anthony Smith has said, where do you come down on these issues?
Well, first of all, good afternoon. I have manners, so good afternoon to everybody on this and everybody who is watching us. That's the downside of this. That I don't know who's watching us. I like to see the faces outside of your beautiful faces. But so good evening to everybody, and thank you for reaching out to me, Stephen, with this panel, particularly this conversation. So I have thoughts. Right. And a couple of thoughts are, yes, so I've been able to engage in this sort of conversation work over the years in various capacities, as you mentioned, as a violence interrupter, as someone who's worked with young people to be organizers around this, from the policy end, part of the New York City Mayor's Office to combat gun violence back when the ending years of the Bloomberg administration, right? And I'm somebody, and I write a lot about these issues. And from a personal perspective, my own experience of being on both sides of the gun, and then also, observing and working with people who are doing amazing work. And I'm thankful that this is a showcase over the last few days in very much ways of the work that is already being done. Oftentimes it's like, well, nobody's doing nothing. That's why and the police will say, or law enforcement will say, or even some elected officials will say, well, that's why we need more, because nobody's doing nothing in this community. And this is so much of a showcase of people are throwing everything in there, they're throwing the kitchen sink, as it were. Right. So I want to say I'm appreciative of that. This panel is called The Politics of Gun Violence. And in some ways, as a writer, I thought it should be the politics of politics/violence. Right. Because here's a couple of things. Right. We often speak about these issues of community violence in a way that is separated from the structure where there's like a society of violence. We expect Black and brown people to be better than the rest of society. And don't get me, I think we might be, you know what I mean? But all jokes aside, we shouldn't have that expectation that one group of people should be better than the rest of the society that they've grown up in conditioning. And I just throw some numbers, right? Because this is the context that we can continue and probably more so speak about these issues of of politics and violence, right? This thing about shootings and gun sales, right? So this year alone, we've had an uptick in the amount of households who have owned guns. Went up from 36%, 32% to 39%, right? We have an uptick in terms of the amount of people who are purchasing guns. In 1 week alone, in April, there was about 1.2 million background checks for guns, meaning people who have applied for the gift. That's 1 week. 1 week, 1.2 million people in this country. And that's just the folks who are applying in a legal way, right? And let's think about the demographics of it, right? 63% of the people who are purchasing or who own guns 60% are male, 73% are white, 10% are Black, 10% are Latinx. Now, the reason why I just throw those numbers into there, we have more guns in this country than we have people. So it's kind of like when we think about all the social inequities that we have when it comes to the racial inequities, the gender inequities, when we think of the socioeconomic inequities, and those things lead to frustrations. I don't know why we think as adults, we get frustrated. I don't know what we think about young people. They get frustrated too. The difference is that we have a little bit of more wisdom, more experience. We have more things to lose. We've gone through the identity issues for the most part in terms of who we are, who we want to be in society. So we got support networks, right? We can pay for a therapist or something, right? You know what I'm saying? But I think though that when you have such like this bloodthirst for weapons, and you put these in a place where people are struggling generationally, what do we expect? Like, what do we? So when you think about the politics of it, it's not only it's one thing to talk about how we interact with each other on a community level, and the work we're doing to support and heal each other and keep each other safe. But no matter what we do, we're still stuck in a place where we're kind of like swimming upstream. You understand what I'm saying? We have a proliferation of access to tools of violence. And the thing about it is, like, when we think about all these these upticks in gun, as I mentioned, the upticks in gun sales, that doesn't take into consideration what happens to the old guns. Like there isn't a gun recycling factory in America, right? People give them, sell them, give them away. And that's, we know about the way guns from the South, people have spoken about the guns from the South get to the North, et cetera. But we just have an overflow of supply. So the demand also increases. That's basic economics that I'm speaking to right there in one instance. But the other part of it is this, so the politics of it is that we don't really as a nation truly want to address the fact that we encourage violence, right? I just want to just speak to that in so many ways. The one thing, and then the other slash part, I said the positive, the positive gun/violence. The violence that we have seen in this, let's say this year alone, if you study the statistics in terms of gun violence, you study gun violence over the year, over a period of time, you will always see that there will be lows and there will be highs. That is it, like that has always been it, right? I just want to just throw that out there. What we're having this year is a surge, and there are reasons. I think Pastor Bride, the homie Pastor Bride, spoke to that, right? We thought about the COVID and all the issues that young folks are also dealing with. But we also consider like it's the summertime that this happens. Every summer around Memorial Day, we will hear about something that's happening in some city or several cities. And then we will have the cacophony of voices saying, this has never happened before. So I just want to, like, for one, just ground ourselves in reality of truth. This has been happening every summer. So probably what we need to be looking at is like, what are we doing incorrectly around the summer months? And what are we doing incorrectly around the thing about the educational system, right? What are we not doing correctly in January through April? Like, what are we not doing then? Because that, these young folks are coming outside now. They're home, and they're not dealing with conflict in a way that is healthy. Because that's what it is, dealing with unhealthy conflict. Go ahead, Steve. You want to jump in?
Well, let me unpack that a bit. So I mean, there's two things I think that's important in among other things what you said. One is you identified a policy issue. Too many guns around, and more people are getting them, and we're just coming out of the pandemic. We may actually not be coming out of the pandemic, but we thought we were. And the second one is behavioral, a sense of fear and perception. And I'd like to widen this a bit because one of the things we haven't talked about is, we know there's a great deal of interest in reforms. Dr. Rice in the last panel showed us a poll that showed a lot of people are in favor of serious reform, whether it's on police issues or in general issues relating to criminal justice. But still there's that perception there that we are a frightened society, that people, it doesn't matter if you're black or you're white or you're brown. I mean, people are afraid of each other. Well, they seem to be. And I'm wondering if you could sort of paint the picture. Marlon, you're in New York. Ms. Gonzalez is in Seattle. Ms. Moore is in Atlanta. To give us a sense of what you feel is the evolving perception of people about where we're at right now as a society. I mean, we agree that it may not have narrowed the window of reforms, but it's certainly changed the perception of what our priorities might have to be right now, policy-wise, as well as in other ways. So Marlon, you can respond to that first, then we can go to the two council presidents, then maybe Anthony, because I have a couple of other questions I want to bring up. We have some questions in our chat box, which I want to bring up. And those of you who have more questions, please put them in the Q&A section.
Yeah. Great. I appreciate that. Listen, I think we playing inside baseball right now, inside basketball, right? We think that because a lot of us think that perceptions have changed, we somehow assume that the rest of the society, the perceptions have changed in terms of how we address these issues of violence. Sadly, or ironically, when you ask many people, even in my own family, about what should be done, the answer is pretty much the same. We need to just throw more police out there, right? I think that there is more, there's a heightened awareness, and social media plays a role in that. But I think even elected officials, if you speak to elected officials, when they go into communities or in smaller community fora, particularly with the people who are most engaged in politics, which are usually older folks, you will hear, at least on a community level, you will hear some of that same rhetoric, sadly, about, we need more of the same. So I just want to say that I think I don't want us to pat ourselves on the back too much and say that we changed the general perception of how to address this, because ultimately, yes, what we're talking about, and I believe over the last 2 days, we're talking about unorthodoxy. unorthodox ways to deal with community issues that have pervaded for decades, right? We want more community involvement. We want less reliance on community. We want to have people who are directly impacted by it to be at the forefront of the table, to be seen as experts. That is all unorthodox. That is not the orthodox way. That's when you go to a criminal justice school. I have one of my undergraduate degrees in criminal justice. When you go to a criminal justice school, you are not hearing that. You're hearing about most of the same thing. So I just wanted to just address it that way. I don't think the general perception is changing. I think we still got more work to do. And I think particularly in this moment, the conversation around is the window closing, maybe. That's how politics work. What's the next thing that comes up on the news? And it may shift. But I think we can't just sort of be laissez-faire in saying that, like, well, a lot of people have done the work of changing the perception. I don't think the perception is generally changed. I think when we think about administration, where like Anthony, you're speaking to, and what the current administration is doing and has, in the process of doing with a lot of our folks that we all know we've worked with in terms of investing more in community. A lot of that has, as this money is being trickled out now as we speak, on a local level, there's still battles, particularly with law enforcement and certain city municipalities, to be able to implement these things in the way the community sees these folks who are advocating for this different perception, a different approach. They're still fighting to get these things done in a way that they feel it needs to be done. So, I'm gonna pass it back to you or pass it on to my colleagues on the panel so I could go in. But I just generally think that there's still more work to do.
So please feel free to jump in. I mean, is policy really behind the issue, or can policy get ahead of the issue, particularly at where it really counts, where the rubber hits the road in city councils and mayor's offices? Ms. Moore?
Well, certainly you can get in front of the issue, and I believe, particularly when we're looking from last year till now, I think what's happened is there's been a lot more awareness that something needs to be done, and there's been awareness that has grown, particularly after George Floyd, to include other people that have seen that there are some injustices, when they couldn't escape it by looking at the video. And so that opened, that was part of the pride of that window that we talked about earlier. So I believe, and I forgot what what was your original question? Because I got off on
the important point is what policy can do, whether policy can get ahead of people's perception.
Yeah, so it can be ahead of it, but again, if things seem to be going okay, people just don't seem to respond. Right. So that's what my point was, is when things happen, they become catalysts. It's, Marlon said, waiting on that next news story that pushes the conversation from a policy standpoint, shifting it from one end to the other. I believe we can get in front of it. What I believe we should do is not lose sight of where we started with that window open, and don't let it close, and continue to do the work.
But the unorthodox approaches that Marlon is talking about, for instance, what's being done right now in Baltimore, which is a whole city approach to public safety, which is beyond police, but working with fire departments, with sanitation departments, with health departments together in a kind of integrated policy. So that we haven't seen a lot of that, and that's the question: whether there's the money for that and whether there's a policy support for that. President Gonzalez.
Yeah, I would just say that I think, so much of what Marlon spoke to really resonates with me and with what I see is happening in Seattle. I'll give you one quick example. Is part of what happened last year, and the very needed pressure that was needed to be put on elected officials. One of the things that came out of that was a demand from Black-led organizations and community leaders for the city council to invest in a historic participatory budgeting process. So this was an effort to create a dedicated bucket of money that would facilitate the evaluation from Black-led organizations and their research as to what it is that is going to be needed in order to really invest in the resilience of our community. And that had unanimous support amongst the city council. The mayor vetoed it, And we had to overturn her veto, which we did unanimously. So that's where the politics comes into play, right? So what kind of message does that send to organizers, most of whom are young Black folks within our community, that you have a city council who's saying, yes, we are going to fulfill this demand. We see this as an important building block towards resilience and freedom and investment in the Black community in Seattle. And then you have a mayor who says, with one stroke of the pen, no, you can't have that. And then the community has to organize again to get us to restore that funding, which we did. And I'll tell you, it's still under attack every single day, still under attack by our mainstream media here in Seattle, as to the appropriateness of investing $3 million in a participatory budgeting program that was specifically designed to uplift the needs of BIPOC communities in the city of Seattle. And so I think I bring that up as an example of agreeing with Marlon that the work is never done, regardless of whether the window is open or closed. And I think it's too easy, the response, to fall back on the status quo of increased officer presence, of emphasis patrols, of more beats for cops to be walking on as the status quo response to violence in our communities is a disservice, and it's a missed opportunity.
So here's the question. Yeah, go ahead, Marlon. Just for 1 minute, I'll give you. Then I want to move to another question.
I want to be a minute. Two things. One is just listening to President to the Council President from Seattle. President, is that you said $3 million for participatory budget. In the grand scheme of things in a city like Seattle, $3 million is nothing. But they're like, that's the struggle. The second, and so that's the level where we're at. The second thing I want to also, I know we're speaking to like our colleagues in the media here, is like the reason why I open up with like the statistical, like the data in terms of like what of the number of guns that are in this country, because I think it's important for us as we report on gun violence in our communities to always connect it to the larger issue of guns in our country. Less than a minute.
That's context. Oh, that's a good point. So here's a question about a specific policy issue brought up by David Holthouse of Cincinnati, which is about the successes, or mainly the strategies that y'all have are operating on in working with police unions, which is one of the main opponents, if I could say that, but not in every city, in every state, of course, when it comes to reimagining police, particularly protecting police against some of what they feel are the dangers of police reform, and their response is usually then to walk back, or suggesting a walk back in policing. And the idea of shifting resources to some of the police budget resources to community-based services, which is not defunding per se, but it's almost there. And I'm wondering as well, maybe Anthony can relate to this in terms of what he sees in terms of that landscape of working with opponents like, or important and powerful lobby groups like police unions in getting that sort of achievement made. Anthony, give us the larger view if we can, and we'll go to maybe Felicia and Lorena after that.
Yeah, so one, I just want to say, I think police unions are a barrier. They have been and continue to be at the local level, the state level, and the federal level. They have a powerful lobby and arm, but I don't think they speak for all law enforcement. I think they act like they do, but they don't. So I think there's other law enforcement groups that we need to bring into the group, like Noble, and other folks who are thinking about reform in a different way and thinking about.
Noble is who?
National Black National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives.
Right.
I believe that's the name. But yeah, so Noble is that. But also there's some models and some cities who are doing some amazing stuff that folks can look to. Ithaca, New York, the mayor and the council there have really shifted what they think about public safety and how they're doing things. The mayor in Brooklyn Center out in Minneapolis, when they lost one of their citizens to police violence, was murdered, he shifted the whole model of public safety in his community, and they're working through that process now. Think about what Mayor Raj Baraka did in Newark when he took away a police station and made it a community-based violence prevention station and took about $11 million from the police budget. The folks in Austin are moving dollars from their police budget to do more community-based stuff. So I think there's models, and we're seeing people being active in this work is how we lift those up and how we support those. Because again, they need the time to be developed out. We've had policing the way we've had it for over 400 years. So we've got to also give all of these other models the same amount of time to be played out. And one of the things that we've got to be real clear about is all of these community-based violence interruption models that we're talking about have never fully been resourced the way they need to be, have never fully been supported the way they need to be. You've heard from a lot of folks on this call, from Dr. Buggs, from Pastor Mike and others who have been doing this work across the country and have data and research to show that it works when it's fully invested. We saw it work in Oakland over 10 years when Oakland saw its decrease because they had a number of things working, not just law enforcement. They had all of those projects all of those programs that we just talked about. So it really is around putting real resources behind this. And I believe, and I'm sure Pastor Mike said it, I'm sure Dr. Bugg said it, is that right now we have an opportunity with these American Rescue dollars to really build out strong infrastructures of resources that we've never had before. And it's been clearly outlined to use it on community violence interruption strategies to really make a difference in this country, not just in a couple of cities, but in this country, if we truly want to address gun violence in this country in a way that's around, not just, it's a way that's got healing in it, it's got community in it, and it's really about us really trying to make a difference and building an infrastructure that can really sustain itself for the next few years, right? So these dollars that are coming into cities, this influx of cash, could really be used in a way to really build out our infrastructure that we've been talking about for a long time. But when it comes to reform and it comes to police unions, they are fighting they're fighting for what they believe is the right way of law, and it's just not what we need right now. And it's not. We don't need this model that has consistently been around controlling Black and brown communities and containing Black and brown communities and protecting and serving white communities. So I just think we got to be real clear about what we've seen. I'm in Louisville, Kentucky, and after the murder of Breonna Taylor, we were more concerned about our downtown Louisville than we were about the loss of life of Breonna Taylor. So we've got to continue to talk about why the structure is the way it is, and then how do we really walk around that and get it to a place where it's really about justice and equity and not just about reforming the police department. Because I think when we just talk about police, we make it so small because it's such a big system that's at play here that create all of this. And I think Marlon brought up even education. There's a lot of kids right now that are saying, we don't want police officers in our school. We want more mental health workers. We want more counselors. We want more access to folks who can help us move and not folks who are going to come and arrest us and put us in danger. So I just think we've got to really be clear now that this is a time to not only reimagine, but redefine what public safety is. And we cannot continue to talk about it as law enforcement, jails, and detention centers, because that's not it.
Well, thank you. President Moore, I don't know what police unions think as a group of community intervention services. I mean, we do know that many police chiefs or senior police executives seem to support programs like Cure Violence, Safe Streets, and similar programs around the country. If you were mayor, is there a trade-off here between getting support for those things from police, for those types of strategies to mitigate violence in neighborhoods, with some sort of accommodation to some of what police say they're worried about, which is delegitimizing their role?
Well, let me just say, first of all, every state is different. And the state of Georgia is a right to work state, so we don't have the collective bargaining and contracts with our police union. So our police unions represent the officers that are members, and that's not all of the officers. And I think that point should be made, that unions don't necessarily represent all of the officers. So they don't have the power and authority that I heard the other council president mention, or, in other states that we hear about. And a lot of times we have to re-educate people here that, those aren't, they don't have any authority of who gets fired, hired, what their disciplinary thing is. Now, they do support their officers if they get in trouble, but they don't have that type of authority. So they just lobby and advocate on their behalf. So I will say that. And the ones that I talk to, officers on all various ranks, when I have one-on-one conversations with them in particular, they're supportive of anything that they feel is going to separate them from having to have these type of interactions. So if there's a program that's out there, and we have Cure Violence in the city of Atlanta and are expanding it, programs like that, if there are programs that are going to help to reduce the violence, I don't see why they wouldn't be supportive of it, because that would be a less violent situation that they feel that they would have to respond to. I know you all talked earlier about whether we should shift money from the police to other programs, and I don't think it's an either or situation, and nor do I think they're mutually exclusive. I think we have a duty and responsibility to make sure that we have these other programs, and whether it's from the American Rescue Act, or whether it's from other grant funding that we receive federally, or whether it's just from our doggone general fund of how we operate the city, we just need to have the will to be wanting to have these programs, and particularly where they're needed in the community. And I think here in our state legislature, I saw when there was an effort from the council, this was right last year when everything was going on, the council wanted to sequester $70-something million from the police budget until they saw that some reforms took place, and it did not pass on one vote. It was a very narrow window. There was another city that attempted to do something similar, and so our state legislature responded with a legislation or bill that says that you can't quote unquote defund police, and you can't reduce a police budget under 5%. So, there was an immediate response to that in the fear that somehow people were going to defund police. But my position is that's not even a starting point. For me, if we want to do these programs, which we should do, we can find the money, whether it's from a part of it from police or any other department or our general fund or from grant funds as we get them from the federal government and otherwise.
So the elephant in the room, if I can make a pun out of it, is really one thing that we haven't been talking about a lot, which is the growing tension between what cities want to do and what state legislatures are willing to let them do. We're beginning to see that. We saw President Trump vilify progressive mayors as being responsible for all the barbaric violence in the streets, and imploring state legislatures to go after it. And I'm wondering whether you guys feel, whether in Seattle, for instance, that there's a constant uphill battle that's preventing you from achieving what you want in the area of community violence intervention because of opposition in your state legislatures.
Yeah, well, I should have started off by saying greetings from the anarchist jurisdiction, right. Seattle, but that got overturned as soon as we got a real president elected. So we are no longer, unfortunately, an anarchist designated jurisdiction. We're just now plain old city of Seattle. So we're really lucky in Seattle to have a democratically led state legislature, but that doesn't immunize our legislature from being influenced by law enforcement lobbying groups and by others to not go as far as they need to create true transformational change for cities like Seattle. So there's a lot of really good things that came out of our state legislature this last session: reform of decertification of existing officers, an ability to do broader background checks into the employment history of officers to better inform hiring decisions for the next place. There were some reforms done to how we do arbitration. There's going to be a major a sort of set list. I can go on and on. Lots of great things came out of the state legislature. Unfortunately, for a city like Seattle that is very progressive and is on sort of the leading edge of reform, a lot of the things that were passed by the state are not likely going to benefit our residents because our existing laws or collective bargaining agreement actually go a little further than those items. So it was sort of the minimum first step that the state legislature was able to accomplish. They are already at work at trying to go further and to build on the work that they did the last legislative session. And I'm really excited about continuing to work with them and with advocates and organizers to see how far we can push the state legislature to really empower cities and counties to really take back control of what public safety is for our communities and how we can redefine it. And I just want to say on the last question that you asked, I mean, I think, again, for a city like Seattle that's in Washington State that has strong labor laws, we continue to move work away from our Seattle Police Department towards alternative models that are non-armed models that are community safety-based interventions. And we did create a new Department of Community Safety and Communications. And one of the things that we are dealing with right now is that the police guilds are okay with letting go some of that work. They're fine with letting go of the things they don't like, but they want to get paid for letting it go. And we got to negotiate it. So I think there's still resistance, right? So we got to be careful for those seemingly gives, because the devil's always in the details as it relates to what exactly it's going to take to actually shift some of that historic away, those bodies of work away from officers to non-law enforcement.
So the follow-up question, which I'd like to occupy the last part of our discussion today, is really the natural follow-up is the role of the federal government. Jay Gilmer of Pittsburgh starts us off with a question about that. She asks, how do we build sufficient partnerships so that the administration after Biden, is looking far ahead, I guess, doesn't completely change directions, violence prevention versus more police. So it's a question that's being asked, of course, everywhere about, how you can institutionalize the kinds of things we're talking about this week: violence prevention, community intervention strategies, obviously in a local setting, a municipal setting, and where the federal government's role belongs properly in that. So maybe Anthony, I can go to you on that, and because you see the national picture and where it's trending, and then we can go to the others and maybe have Marlon comment.
Yeah, I think first we've got to make sure that we get this that $5 billion that the Biden administration has set aside to support this work over the next 8 years has got to be passed. So we've got to work on making sure that we're advocating to our federal elected officials that actually gets passed, right? We need our mayors and council members and county elected folks and state folks to say we need those dollars to pass. But then two, I think there's also a movement, to your point. We've been asking cities and states and counties to create Office of Violence Prevention. We need one at the national level, at the federal level. That's an office that's mandated, that's in law, that doesn't go away based on who's there, and has a clear charter of what it's for and what it's supposed to do. I think that's a start. But I also think, using organizations like Cities United, National League of Cities, U.S. Conference of Mayors to really work in partnership with local elected officials to say this is what we need to see consistently, no matter who's in office. So I think there's some ways for us to really advocate, one, to get that $5 billion passed, but then also to start talking about how do we institutionalize this, to your point, Stephen, and create an office that supports this work and brings in, because again, this is not just about this office. This office needs to be able to work across all of the departments at the federal level, because we need we need the Department of Education playing a role. We need DOL, Department of Labor playing a role. We need all of our departments, really HUD. We need the Department of Transportation, because it's going to take all of these different entities to really for us to address this in the way that we're trying to, this comprehensive, holistic way that you brought up when you talked about Mayor Scott. So it starts there, right? So we got an administration that's really keen on this, that's working on this. We need to support them and help them get their bills and their policies passed. But then two, we got to push them to do even more, to think about this office and then what this office can do and how this office can move across all of the departments to really help align this issue when we talk about what public safety is, and then how those dollars trickle down to the state and how they trickle down to the county and then how they trickle down to the cities is going to be really, really important.
Right, that's helpful. Felicia? Should we be optimistic?
Well, I think we should always have optimism, but with realistic expectations. This is not easy work, and as we've all said, it's a continual effort. Whatever we can do to institutionalize it. I'm very familiar with Cities United. I'm an active member of the National League of Cities. Been talking about this a long time before it's now really getting a space and place where that work that's been done can be brought and brought to fore. I believe one of the ways that we institutionalize it is we however big this window of opportunity is open, and take advantage of it and really get what we can get working on the ground and show some real examples so that people can see. I think people hear other alternative solutions, but the fallback is more officers, more incarceration. Right. But if we have an opportunity, as Anthony said earlier, to use these dollars and other opportunities to fund some of these programs that are alternatives that actually work, and we get some chance for people to see the success in them, then it will make it something that people will support and say. I mean, when I say people, I mean, everyone can see how it benefits.
Thank you. Lorena?
Yeah, I mean, obviously the federal government plays a critical role. And I think from a city leadership perspective, where the rubber really hits the road, right? We are the ones who are suffering the losses every single day in our communities. I need Congress to hear the cries and the sorrows of the mothers who are losing their children to police violence and to other forms of gun violence every day in our community. And the number one way for Congress to deal with that, and for Biden to deal with that, is to have the courage to take on the gun lobby and prevent the free flow of firearms that are not necessary into our communities. That will allow people like me and President Moore to really focus on what cities should be focused on, which is building parks, creating great schools, dealing with income inequality and poverty in our city by investing in the health and the education and the well-being of our children, not after they've been born, but even before they've been born. Like, this is what we as cities are designed to do. And right now we're sort of trying to empty an ocean of violence out with a thimble. And it's just impossible for cities to truly meet the needs of community safety so long as these weapons of destruction in our neighborhoods are allowed to just pervade. And that is ultimately what we need the federal government to do. And then allow us the opportunity to really focus our limited resources on investing in the healing and in the resilience and in the systems that our families need to really be able to thrive, not just live, but thrive.
Thank you. Marlon, I'm going to leave you with a final comment. I just heard from Felicia that there's a storm brewing or underway in Atlanta, so we may lose you. So if we do, many thanks in advance, and I hope you'll stay dry for the moment, but let's see how it goes. But Marlon, over to you for the final.
Thank you. Felicia, we will never lose you, Felicia. No, I'll be brief though. I think what we do is follow the precedent of what we have done, in a sense. So when I think about even where folks are now, have gotten American Rescue Act, is my correct? These are folks who have been in the work for a long time on a community level. One of the people I think stand out to me is Erica Ford, a good friend of mine. It's like, I think about her when I was in the game starting, she was like there, right, already, right? And I think of Pastor McBride, like, there are people who have, been in this game, and I've seen them from a community level to small community meetings, to local conferences, to state conferences, to federal conferences, and building network as organized across the country to be able to get to this point where we can say, well, a cure of violence in the sense in New York City is pretty much institutionalized for the most part, right? So I just want to say that I think we have been doing it. To answer that question, rely on people in the community. I think you said, I believe Pastor McBride had said this earlier, right? Rely on the people in the community to get shit done. Like, that's how we got here. Biden didn't come up with this idea. He didn't come up with this, right? His administration, his top advisors did not come up with this. It was our folks that did. And I think that's a powerful lesson. That's a powerful lesson even in this moment where in right now where we're talking about less reliance on police. Our community is saying that is a wonderful thing right now, because the community is saying, well, we know how to galvanize each other. Give us some money, give us some time, and we're going to do it. So I just answer that question. I think that how do we do it is follow the leadership of people who have been doing it for some time now, and to breed that type of leadership in the pipeline.
Thank you, Marlon. Well, I knew that when we conceived of this panel, getting at the politics of the issue was going to be tough. And we were going to go a little bit far afield than just violence in community to community intervention. But I'm glad we did. And I'm really appreciative to our panelists, Felicia Moore, Lorena Gonzalez, Anthony Smith, and of course, Marlon, for really taking us a long ways towards understanding where we need to go from here. So thanks to you all. And Felicia, I hope you stay dry over the next day. But
I will,
again,
thank you.
Thank you so much for your time. We're going to take a 15-minute break now before we head into our final panel of the day. And you guys, if you're dry, if you have the time, please join us. We're going to be talking more specifically about what and how journalists can cover this issue in a better way. So thank you all.
guys.
Thank you, everybody. Take care.
Bye-bye.